Picture an old Harlem hustler laying down with a shotgun next to the bed, never sleeping too heavy, waiting for footsteps outside. His name never filled the papers like the others, but the streets kept whispering about him every chance they got. Harlem had plenty legends who got rich and flashy, but most ended up locked down, snitched on, or stretched out in a coffin. Somehow, this man survived every storm that came his way. From the days of Bumpy Johnson running Harlem's corners to the night Tupac Shakur got gunned down in Vegas, his shadow never left the conversation. The question is, how did he outlast them all? In the 1920s, Harlem carried two faces. One was the Harlem Renaissance, jazz, poetry, art. The other was the street economy of numbers, rackets, and hustlers. Stephanie Street Claire, Madame St. Clair, built an empire in the numbers game, pulling in hundreds of thousands a year while resisting mobsters like Dutch Schultz. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson rose under her wing. After Schultz's death in 1935, Bumpy struck deals with the Genovese family, keeping control in Harlem without endless mob wars. He went down for heroin in the 1950s and served time in Alcatraz, but Harlem greeted him with a parade when he came home. By his 1968 death, he was a folk hero. His passing left Harlem unstable. Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, and others stepped up, but none lasted. The lesson was clear. Only paranoia and discipline could keep a man alive in Harlem's underworld. After Bumpy, heroin reigned. Nicky Barnes, calling himself Mr. Untouchable, led the Council, a consortium that worked with the Lucchese family and controlled Harlem heroin. At his peak in the mid-1970s, he was worth over $50 million and even made the cover of the New York Times magazine. But in 1977, he was convicted, betrayed by his own crew, and flipped on them in revenge, destroying his own empire. Frank Lucas followed a similar arc. He boasted of smuggling heroin from Southeast Asia in soldiers' coffins and branding it blue magic. He bragged of making $1 million a day until a 1976 raid ended it. He too became a government witness. Their downfalls proved Harlem had no patience for the loud and flashy. Young hustlers like Eric Vonzip Martin saw the danger in chasing headlines. He would play it differently, quiet, careful, always in the shadows. By the 1980s, heroin waned and crack took over. The streets became a war zone. Teenagers like Rich Porter, Alpo Martinez, and Ozzie Faison made millions fast, parading cars and jewelry, but the fame was fatal. In 1989, Rich's 12-year-old brother was kidnapped and murdered in a family betrayal. A month later, Rich himself was gunned down by Alpo, his own partner. Alpo later cooperated with feds, admitting to murders, and Harlem never forgave him. He was killed in 2021. Meanwhile, Clarence "Preacher" Heatley built the Preacher Crew, infamous for kidnappings and nearly 45 murders. They even allegedly kidnapped Bobby Brown over a debt. He pled guilty in 1999 and got life. On the opposite end, Richard Fritz Simmons ran quietly, moving hundreds of kilos, living in a small apartment, driving an old Nissan. No flashy displays. His suspected poisoning in 1991 ended his story without spectacle. The lessons were written in blood. Flashy ones burned fast, quiet ones lasted. This was the era Vonzip absorbed, shaping his code of survival. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was learning how to outlast everyone. Eric Martin came into the world in Harlem during the early 1950s, when the neighborhood was still buzzing with jazz clubs and street corners filled with hustlers chasing opportunities. His family lived around 118th Street near Lenox Avenue, a stretch that always had card games in smoky back rooms and numbers runners collecting dimes from neighbors. The 118th Street crew was a loose network of hustlers who controlled small heroin spots, after-hours joints, and gambling tables where money changed hands quickly. As a teenager, Zip drifted toward them, not as the loudest figure, but as the one who watched and learned. Older hustlers remembered him as a young man who understood how dangerous visibility could become, so he studied how to stay in the background while still pulling strings. He was the guy who let other people shine while he calculated his next move, and that patience separated him from flashier friends. Zip understood that law enforcement and rival crews always targeted the loudest hustler on the block. He made himself valuable by being reliable, calm, and always connected to the right players. That habit of moving in shadows became the foundation of his long survival. By the late 1970s, Zip started shifting away from street corner, hustling into businesses that looked legitimate but kept money flowing. He opened Justine's, a Harlem lounge that pulled in hustlers, athletes, and up-and-coming entertainers who wanted to party. Later, he connected with The Tunnel, one of Manhattan's wildest nightclubs, during the late 1980s and early 1990s. These spots became crossroads where basketball stars, drug dealers, rappers, and promoters brushed shoulders while drinks poured all night. Zip stood in the middle of that nightlife like a quiet owner who knew everyone's name but never showed his hand. People in Harlem talked about how generous he could be when he felt like it. Stories spread of him walking into bars and paying for every single drink until the bottles ran out. Mothers in Harlem remembered him dropping off envelopes of cash when rent was due or when kids needed new clothes. That generosity built him respect and kept many people loyal because everyone loves a man who takes care of the block. Still, generosity never meant softness because everyone also knew Zip had a ruthless edge when it came to protecting his position. Friends said he carried paranoia everywhere and it shaped how he lived. He never trusted phones for business conversations and always used drivers instead of riding solo. At night, he was known to keep a shotgun close by his bed, a habit he carried for decades because Harlem hustlers collected enemies as fast as they collected money. To him, being ready at every moment was not drama, it was survival. People said he slept light, always half awake, always listening for footsteps outside the door. One thing that made Zip different from many Harlem bosses was his discipline with personal habits. He stayed away from drugs completely and rarely touched liquor beyond a casual drink. While other hustlers burned themselves out with heavy cocaine use or constant partying, Zip kept a clear head. His vices were money, women, and control, but he stayed sharp enough to see dangers before they arrived. That self-control helped him navigate storms that destroyed plenty of men around him. Zip avoided becoming the front man of any single operation because he preferred to be the man behind the man. He let partners carry the spotlight while he collected the money and controlled the moves. This strategy meant his name stayed out of newspapers and court filings, even while his presence shaped the deals across Harlem. He was connected to promoters, boxers, and rappers, but most of the time the public only saw the people he stood behind. In that way, he built a reputation as the ultimate connector, a man you needed to know but rarely saw on stage. The streets respected that style because they understood that every kingpin eventually faced prison or death once they got too much attention. Nicky Barnes landed on magazine covers and ended up in federal custody. Frank Lucas bragged about blue magic and saw his empire collapse. Rich Porter drove flashy cars and ended up dead on Orchard Beach Road. Zip watched those cautionary tales and kept his moves quiet. He built wealth, earned influence, and created a legacy without exposing himself to the spotlight that destroyed others. People close to him said his reputation was built on loyalty and discipline as much as money. He paid his soldiers better than most and expected silence in return. That combination of generosity and ruthlessness kept his circle small and tight because betrayal was not tolerated. Harlem always had plenty of hustlers who came and went, but Zip carved out a position that lasted for decades. He learned from the streets, adapted to new eras, and kept himself hidden in plain sight. That was Eric Vonzip Martin, the Harlem OG who slept with a shotgun by his bed while the city shifted outside his window. He grew from 118th Street hustler into nightclub owner, connector, and street legend who played both sides of Harlem life without letting either side consume him. His story shows how patience, paranoia, and discipline could make a man outlast nearly every storm Harlem ever produced. By the early 1990s, Harlem was no longer just the land of numbers and heroin because hip-hop had become the loudest sound on the block. The culture was booming across New York, and Harlem's influence sat heavy in that mix with Uptown Records and Bad Boy rising fast. Eric Vonzip Martin already had one foot in the street game, but he started putting the other into music and nightlife. He understood that rappers, promoters, boxers, and hustlers moved in the same circles, and he built himself into a connector who knew everyone. One story that spread across Harlem came from heavyweight boxing, where Mike Tyson was the biggest star of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Tyson spoke in interviews about Harlem hustlers and laughed when he told a story involving Vonzip and his own promoter, Don King. Tyson claimed Don King once trusted Zip to deliver $600,000 for a fight deal, but Zip pocketed the entire bag. The way Tyson told it, King could not retaliate because the deal itself was off the books, and the loss embarrassed him badly. That story was never verified in official records, but it became part of Harlem's oral history. The image of a Harlem hustler finessing Don King gave Zip a reputation as someone untouchable. Tyson still kept him close, inviting him to fights and sometimes listening to his advice on money. Vonzip's most significant connection came with Sean Puffy Combs, who came out of Harlem and rose from an Uptown Records intern to the head of Bad Boy Records. Puffy moved with ambition, but also faced threats from rivals, and Vonzip positioned himself as both connector and protector. He introduced Puffy to Los Angeles figures who could offer muscle whenever Bad Boy moved on the West Coast. That kind of introduction mattered because the East Coast and West Coast rap feud was starting to heat up, and security meant survival. Zip's street credibility gave Puffy cover in places where industry contracts could not help him. Rumors floated that Vonzip had a close relationship with Foxy Brown when she was emerging as a star in the mid-1990s. Some people said he dated her, while others said he acted like a protector or mentor during her legal troubles. Foxy never confirmed any of these claims, and the stories stayed in the territory of gossip. Still, the rumors kept his name linked with her career and painted him as a man who moved between the underworld and the music spotlight. Harlem also produced Damon Dash, who partnered with Sean Jay-Z Carter to launch Rockefeller Records. Dash came from Uptown hustling and knew Harlem OGs from his teenage years, and he spoke about how older hustlers gave him lessons on handling money and people. Vonzip was older than Dash and Jay-Z, and stories said he gave them advice on avoiding the mistakes of flashy hustlers. Jay-Z rarely mentioned him in public, but insiders believe Zip's way of staying quiet and reinvesting money influenced how Rockefeller approached business. Jay-Z eventually became a billionaire, but Harlem always whispered that men like Zip helped shape his early moves. Vonzip built his reputation by being the OG who could walk in two different rooms. He could stand in a Harlem bar surrounded by hustlers, handing out cash, then later sit in a Manhattan nightclub booth with Puffy, Tyson, and rappers planning their next project. He didn't rap, didn't manage, and didn't put his name on contracts, but his shadow was present in deals and parties. Harlem OGs like him bridged the street economy and the music industry, giving young artists both protection and connections. That dual identity created his image as Harlem's OG who survived the drug wars while still finding a seat at the table of hip-hop. Unlike rappers who exaggerated their street ties, Zip carried the real resume and still managed to keep his freedom. For Harlem youth, his example showed how a man could remain respected in the streets while rubbing shoulders with music's biggest names. That balance between two worlds gave him staying power because everyone needed him, but nobody could fully claim him. The story of Vonzip's name circling around Tupac Shakur's death begins with a night in New York City in 1994. Tupac walked into Quad Studios in Manhattan for a recording session and ended up getting shot multiple times in the lobby. That shooting opened a wound between him and Bad Boy Records because he blamed the notorious B.I.G. and Puffy for setting him up. The streets whispered about betrayal, and the music industry turned attention into open hostility between both coasts. By 1995 and 1996, the East Coast and West Coast feud had grown bigger than music, with entourages moving like armies. Bad Boy held power in New York with Biggie Smalls and Puffy, while Death Row ran Los Angeles with Suge Knight and Tupac. Threats turned into diss tracks, and the media painted it as a war that stretched beyond songs. Security details moved like street crews, and real gang members stood around famous rappers at shows and parties. One of the men tied to those situations was Dwayne Keith D. Davis, a Compton figure connected to the Southside Crips. His crew often provided protection for visiting rappers on the West Coast, and he later claimed they were hired by Bad Boy. Keith said Puffy asked him to put together work against Tupac and Suge Knight during the summer of 1996. According to his later statements, Puffy promised $1 million for the job, and Keith accepted half up front. The story goes that Keith handed both the money and a .40 caliber Glock pistol to Vonzip, who was supposed to move it along. Keith's version had Zip holding the bag and never delivering the gun to the shooters, leaving a question mark about his real role. Tupac was shot in Las Vegas on September 7th, 1996, and died 6 days later. Afterward, Keith said he asked Puffy if they were responsible, and Puffy supposedly responded, yes. For years, the claims lived in magazines, documentaries, and interviews without any hard proof. Keith repeated the story multiple times, including in his 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend. In 2009, he was arrested on federal drug charges and faced a long sentence, which pushed him to cooperate. Detectives from the LAPD and Las Vegas police brought him into an investigation on the Tupac case. Keith agreed to act as a confidential informant and even flew to New York with them to bait Vonzip into a narcotics deal. The reports later showed that Keith tried to draw Zip into moving drugs, but Zip refused and said he was out of that life. Investigators wanted evidence linking him to the Tupac hit, but the attempt failed because Zip would not play into it. Keith still gave statements that half the money was given to Zip after the shooting, but detectives could not find confirmation. In 2023, Keith D. himself was indicted in Nevada on charges related to Tupac's murder. Prosecutors made clear in press conferences that they did not have corroboration for charging Puffy or Vonzip. They explained that the only link came from Keith's word, and he had changed his story many times. Keith admitted involvement in some versions, then backed away in others, creating doubt about his credibility. Despite the lack of legal evidence, rumors about Zip's role grew stronger in the streets. Some stories claim Puffy handed him a suitcase with hundreds of thousands of dollars as payment. Others swore Zip kept the money for himself and left Keith's crew unpaid, which created more tension. Gossip tied him to supplying the gun or hiding it, though no firearm ever surfaced in official files. Vonzip's name floated in conversations because he already moved as Harlem's silent connector with one foot in the music world. People saw him around Puffy, saw him in Los Angeles, and figured he had inside knowledge. The fact that he never talked only added to the legend, because silence fuels mystery in street storytelling. The public picture showed prosecutors with no evidence and detectives with no corroborated leads beyond Keefe's testimony. The street picture painted Vonzip as the older Harlem OG holding secrets no one else could ever reveal. He was the man too seasoned to get caught on tape, too careful to leave paperwork, and too smart to brag. Whether the suitcase of money ever existed or whether the gun ever passed through his hands remains unanswered. What is clear is that the Whispers gave him a mythical role in one of hip-hop's darkest tragedies. The official records placed him outside the circle of suspects, but Harlem barber shops and industry corners kept saying his name. In the end, the allegations built another layer to his reputation. He had already survived heroin bosses, crack wars, and Harlem politics, and now his name sat inside the biggest murder case in rap history. That connection, even without proof, made him part of the folklore surrounding Tupac's death. And once again, Vonzip managed to stay standing, while others either fell to prison or ended up in graves. Vonzip's greatest achievement was not how much money he made or who he knew, but the fact he stayed free. Harlem had seen powerful men like Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, and countless others get locked away for decades. Barnes went down after his empire collapsed. Lucas lost everything when federal agents raided his home, and even Bumpy Johnson had years inside Alcatraz. Vonzip never served major time because he learned early how to shift gears whenever the pressure came his way. He avoided heavy indictments by constantly moving into different lanes whenever law enforcement cracked down. When heroin brought the feds swarming Harlem during the 1970s, he leaned toward clubs and nightlife that kept him looking legitimate. When crack cocaine flooded the streets in the mid-'80s, he did not jump in loud with flashy crews like Alpo Martinez or Rich Porter. Instead, he focused on investments that looked clean while still letting him control money behind closed doors. His ability to move sideways instead of head-on saved him from the same fate that swallowed so many others. Vonzip spread his money across multiple hustles that stretched from Harlem to downtown Manhattan and even Miami. He invested in real estate, which meant steady cash and fewer questions from investigators. He stayed tied to boxing, where his friendships with fighters and promoters gave him business opportunities without street-level heat. His clubs, like Justine's, and connections to the Tunnel provided both income and social power because everybody from rappers to athletes wanted entry. He even backed record label ventures and music projects that kept him connected to the growing hip-hop economy. By never relying on one hustle, he stayed afloat when others drowned under federal crackdowns. One thing people remembered was how he handled disputes without letting bodies pile up too fast. If a young hustler robbed another, Vonzip would sometimes pay the victim directly, then pull the offender aside with advice. That approach made both sides owe him something, and it turned him into a mediator the block respected. When you have a man who can fix problems without pulling the trigger, loyalty comes strong. People trusted him because they knew he preferred solutions that kept everyone moving, even if his generosity always came with expectations. His ability to keep loyalty intact meant fewer people willing to testify or turn against him. Federal cases often fell apart because witnesses flipped, but Zip kept his circle small and paid well enough to keep mouths shut. Harlem hustlers spoke about how loyalty was everything, and he mastered the art of buying it and protecting it. That skill kept him alive in a world where betrayal ended many lives. Another reason he lasted was how little the public saw of him. Photos of Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas flooded newspapers, but images of Vonzip remained rare. He avoided interviews, stayed off magazine covers, and never sought fame the way other Harlem bosses did. His low profile made it hard for prosecutors to build a public narrative against him. Fame made people vulnerable, but invisibility turned Zip into a shadow that kept moving. Even with his low profile, he never forgot that enemies existed everywhere, which shaped how he lived day to day. He never trusted phones for serious conversations, and he constantly rotated drivers and associates. His paranoia was not weakness, it was survival. The stories of him keeping a shotgun under his bed every night became a symbol of that survival mindset. Some people believed it literally because they had seen him reach for it. Others believed it was symbolic of the way he slept light, never fully resting, always ready for footsteps outside. That habit summed up how Vonzip outlasted everyone else. He carried Harlem's paranoia into his lifestyle and made it work as a shield. He survived because he never chased headlines, never trusted too many people, and always prepared for the worst. Harlem lost plenty of legends to sales and caskets, but the man with the shotgun by his bed managed to keep breathing. His story became less about how much power he held and more about how long he lasted while everything around him collapsed. By the early 2000s, Vonzip slowed down in Harlem and started spending more time in South Florida. People close to him said he shifted into nightclubs and real estate deals that gave him steady money without drawing heat. Miami and South Beach became his playground, with stories of investments in lounges and condos that looked completely legitimate. He stayed around celebrities when needed, but mostly kept a quiet routine while stacking cash through businesses the feds could not easily target. In 2012, the news of his death spread through Harlem circles, and word was that cancer took him at only 58 years old. His passing never hit major headlines like the deaths of Rich Porter or Biggie Smalls, but Harlem streets treated it like the end of an era. Some said he died surrounded by family, while others said he kept moving quietly until the very last days. Either way, his funeral gatherings in Harlem brought out old hustlers, rappers, and neighborhood folks who respected how long he survived. Some threw parties in his honor, while others paid quiet visits, leaving the kind of respect that never fades. Rumors circulated about what he left behind, with whispers of luxury cars, properties, and stashes of designer clothes. People said his estate included South Beach condos, Harlem apartments, and even a collection of classic vehicles. Whether all of that was true or not, the talk reflected how people imagined his wealth after decades of hustling. Stories also spread about his son, sometimes called Zip Jr., stepping into real estate projects both in Harlem and Miami. Interviews connected to reality shows painted him as someone trying to run legitimate businesses while still honoring his father's memory. Just like Jay-Z once transitioned from hustler to mogul, Zip's family seemed focused on making the next generation legitimate. Vonzip's legacy stayed rooted in the idea of survival. He became known as the Harlem OG who outlasted everyone, the man who never let fame or prison take him out. The shotgun by his bed turned into a symbol of how paranoia and discipline kept him alive. Even in death, Harlem still whispered his name because survival itself had become his legend. The story of Vonzip lives between fact and folklore because official files never tied him to major murders. Still, whispers painted him as the Harlem OG holding secrets too deep for paper. His survival defined his reputation more than any confirmed crime ever could. Harlem has always blurred truth and rumor, creating myths out of men who simply managed to last. Vonzip's life showed how patience, paranoia, and discipline could turn into legend. In a world where every name eventually fell, the OG with a shotgun by his side became the story that refused to die.